InkBreaking.com. Lesson number 1. Introducing yourself. Past tense. Questions and answers. Jane was a Yank. Was Jane British or American?
American. Jane was a yes, she was American.
American. Jane was a Yank. Jane was an American. Was she an Australian?
No, she wasn't. She was a yes, she was American.
No, she wasn't an Australian. Jane was a Yank. She was an American. Who was a Yank?
Jane was a yes, she was American.
Jane was a Yank. She was an American. Jane was sitting in the restaurant alone.
Was sitting in the restaurant alone.
Was Jane sitting with a friend?
No, she wasn't. She sitting in the restaurant alone.
No, she wasn't. Jane was sitting in a restaurant alone. Who was Jane sitting with?
She sitting in the restaurant alone.
She was sitting with no one. Jane was sitting in the restaurant alone. Was Jane sitting in a hotel?
No, she wasn't. She sitting in the restaurant.
No, Jane was sitting in the restaurant. She had just arrived in Vietnam. She walked to a restaurant. Had she lived in Vietnam for 6 months?
No, she wasn't lived in Vietnam for 6 months. She had just arrived in Vietnam.
Jane hadn't lived in Vietnam for 6 months. She had just arrived in Vietnam. Did Jane walk to a restaurant?
Yes, she walked to a restaurant.
Yes, Jane walked to a restaurant. She walked to a restaurant. Did Jane take a taxi to a museum?
No, she didn't take the taxi to the museum. She was at
No,
restaurant.
Jane didn't take a taxi to a museum. She walked to a restaurant.
She walked a restaurant.
She knew no one in Vietnam and was sitting by herself. Did Jane have many friends in Vietnam?
No, she didn't have many friends in Vietnam. She knew no one
Jane
in
didn't
Vietnam.
have many friends in Vietnam. She knew no one in Vietnam. How many people did Jane know in Vietnam?
She knew no one in Vietnam.
None. She knew no one in Vietnam. Why was Jane sitting alone?
She was sitting alone because she knew no one in Vietnam.
She was sitting alone because she knew no one in Vietnam. Jane was feeling a little lonely because she knew no one and had no friends in Vietnam. Why was Jane feeling lonely?
Jane was feeling lonely because she knew no one and had no
Jane
friends
was feeling
in
lonely
Vietnam.
because she knew no one and had no friends in Vietnam. Was Jane feeling lonely?
Yes, she was feeling lonely.
Yes, she was feeling lonely. Jane was feeling lonely. Was Jane feeling lonely because she had no job?
No, she wasn't feeling lonely because she has no job.
Jane was feeling lonely because she knew no one and had no friends
in Vietnam.
Did Jane have many friends in Vietnam?
No, Jane didn't. She knew no one and had
she didn't
no
have
friends
many friends
in Vietnam.
She knew no one and had no friends in Vietnam. Quan walked in, ordered his food, and sat at the table next to Jane's. Did Quan sit outside the restaurant at a table?
No, Quan didn't. Quan
No, he sat at the table next to Jane's.
Jane.
Did Quan walk out of the restaurant?
No, Quan didn't out of the restaurant.
No,
She
he
walked
didn't walk
in.
out of the
She
restaurant.
walked in,
He walked in, ordered his food, and
and
sat at the table next to
Jane.
Jane's. Where did Quan sit in the
At
restaurant?
the table next to Jane's.
At the table next to Jane. He sat at the table next to Jane's. He began a conversation with Jane. Who began a conversation with Jane?
Quan began a conversation with Jane.
Quan. Quan started a conversation with Jane. Did he finish a conversation with Jane?
No, she didn't finish the conversation with Jane. She began.
No,
She began
Quan
a
didn't finish his
conversation
conversation with Jane. He began a conversation with Jane. What did Quan begin with Jane?
A conversation. Quan began a conversation with Jane.
A conversation. Quan began a conversation with Jane. Quan asked Jane questions to get to know her better. Did Quan ask Jane questions to hire her for a job?
No, Quan didn't ask Jane to hire her for a job. Quan asked
No,
Jane
Quan
questions
didn't
to
ask
get to
Jane
her
questions to hire her for a
better.
job. Quan asked Jane questions to get to know her better. Why did Quan ask Jane questions?
Jane asked Quan asked Jane questions
Quan
to
asked
get
Jane
to know her
questions to get
better.
to know her better. Did Quan tell Jane a story to amuse Jane?
No, she didn't. She
No, Quan didn't tell Jane a story to
No,
amuse
Quan
Jane.
didn't
Quan
amuse
asked
Jane.
Jane questions to get to know her better. Jane told Quan her story and why she was in Vietnam. Did Jane refuse to talk to Quan?
No, Jane didn't refuse to talk
No,
to Quan.
Jane
She,
didn't refuse to talk to
talked,
Quan. Jane
her
told Quan her story and why she was in Vietnam.
Was in Vietnam.
What did Jane tell Quan?
Her story and why she was in Vietnam.
Her story and why she was in Vietnam. Jane told Quan her story and why she was in Vietnam. Did Jane sing songs to Quan?
No, she didn't sing song to Quan. She told Quan
No,
her story
Jane
and
didn't
why
sing
she
songs to
was
Quan.
in Vietnam.
Jane told Quan her story and why she was in Vietnam.